Now we turn to our extremely distinguished panel. We welcome you back, Vice President Gore. Whenever you are ready, please begin.
Well, thank you, Chairman Markey and Mr. Upton, Chairman Waxman, Congressman Barton, Chairman Emeritus John Dingell. I was telling Senator Warner in the cloakroom here that it was one of the greatest honors of my life to be a member of this committee, and my principal mentor in the Congress was John Dingell. And I told Senator Warner that just about everything I learned about the legislative process came from John Dingell, and it is with great emotion that I come back to this hearing room, and members of the committee, members of the subcommittee, members of the full committee, it's an honor to be able to appear before you here today.
Could you move the microphone in just a little bit closer, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
It is also my great honor to testify with my friend and former colleague in the Senate, John Warner. I served on the Armed Services Committee under his chairmanship, and his long record of service to the Senate and the country is truly remarkable. Senator Warner has consistently looked with a steady gaze past the politics of the day to thoughtfully and intensely focus on the national interest. His approach really reminds me of another great American from another era, the great Senator Arthur Vandenberg from Michigan, who helped to create the United Nations and NATO and the Marshall Plan. He understood that our nation, when faced with great peril, must rise above partisanship to meet the challenge.
Mr. Vice President, can you push that button if the microphone...
There we go.
Oh, there. Good. Thank you.
You want me to repeat all of my words about Senator Warner? I believe that we have arrived at another such moment. Our country is at risk on three fronts. The economic crisis is clear. Our national security remains at risk so long as we remain dangerously dependent on flows of foreign oil from reserves owned by sovereign states that are vulnerable to disruption. The rate of new discoveries, as members of this committee know, is falling, even as demand elsewhere in the world is rising. Most importantly, of course, we are, along with the rest of humanity, facing the dire and growing threat of the climate crisis. It is at the very heart of those threats that this committee and this Congress must direct its focus. I am here today to lend my support to what I believe to be one of the most important pieces of legislation ever introduced in the Congress. I believe this legislation has the moral significance equivalent to that of the civil rights legislation of the 1960s and the Marshall Plan of the late 1940s. By repowering America with a transition to a clean energy economy and ending our dangerous over-reliance on carbon-based fuels, which is, after all, the common thread running through all three of these crises, this bill will simultaneously address the climate crisis, the economic crisis, and the national security threats that stem from our dependence on foreign oil. We cannot afford to wait any longer for this transition. Each day that we continue with the status quo sees more of our fellow Americans struggling to provide for their families. Each day that we continue on our current path, America loses more of its competitive edge. And each day that we wait, we increase the risk that we will leave our children and grandchildren an irreparably damaged planet. Passage of this legislation will restore America's leadership of the world and begin at long last to solve the climate crisis. And it is truly a moral imperative. Moreover, the scientific evidence of how serious this climate crisis is becoming continues to amass week after week. Let me share with you just a few recent examples. The Arctic is warming at an unprecedented rate. New research, which draws upon recently declassified data collected by U.S. nuclear submarines traveling under the Arctic ice cap for the last 50 years, have given us for the first time a three-dimensional view of the ice cap. And researchers at the Naval Postgraduate School have told us that the entire Arctic ice cap which for most of the last 3 million years has covered an area the size of the lower 48 states, may completely and totally disappear in summer in as little as 5 years. Almost half of the ice in the Arctic cap has already melted during the last 20 years. The dark ocean, once uncovered, absorbs 90% of the solar heat that used to bounce off the highly reflective ice. As a direct consequence, some of the vast amounts of frozen carbon in the permafrost in the land surrounding the Arctic Ocean are beginning to be released as methane as the frozen tundra thaws, threatening a doubling of global warming pollution in the atmosphere unless we take action quickly. Melting of the Greenland ice sheet has reached a new record, which was a staggering 60% above the previous high in 1998. The most recent 11 summers there have all experienced melting greater than the average of the past 35-year time series. Glacial earthquakes have been increasing on Greenland as the meltwater tunnels down through the ice to the bedrock below. Were the Greenland ice sheet to melt, crack up, and slip into the North Atlantic, sea level worldwide would rise almost 20 feet. We already know that the Antarctic Peninsula is warming at 3 to 5 times the global average rate. At the time when I participated in one of the first hearings on global warming on this committee in the 1970s, a researcher warned that an early alarm bell that this crisis was reaching emergency proportions would be if we saw the breakup of large ice sheets on the Antarctic Peninsula. That's why and this warming has already caused the Larsen B ice shelf, which was the size of Rhode Island, to collapse. Several other ice shelves have also collapsed in the last 20 years. Another large shelf, the Wilkins ice shelf, which is roughly the size of Northern Ireland, is now beginning to disintegrate right before our very eyes. A recent study in the journal Science has now confirmed that the entire West Antarctic ice sheet is warming. Scientists have told us that if it were to collapse and slide into the sea, we would experience global sea level rise of another 20 feet. Each meter of sea level increase leads to 100 million climate refugees. Recent studies have shown that many coastal areas in the United States are at risk, particularly southern Florida and southern Louisiana. Also, carbon dioxide pollution is now changing the very chemistry of the world ocean. Ocean acidification is already underway and is accelerating. A recent paper published in Science described how the seawater off the coast of Northern California has now already, for some periods of the year, become so acidic from CO2 that it is actually corrosive. To give some sense of perspective, for the last 44 million years, the average pH has been 8.2, and the scientists at Scripps have now measured levels off the north coast of California and Oregon at a pH of 7.75. Now, the lower the pH, the more acidic the ocean water. Coral polyps that make reefs and everything in the ocean that makes a shell are now beginning to suffer from a kind of osteoporosis because the acidification levels have reached the state that it begins to dissolve the shells as they are formed. Salmon have now disappeared off the coast of California. Researchers are now working to determine the cause and whether or not this is due to acidity and the relationship between acidity and the so-called dead zones of extreme oxygen depletion that now stretch from the west coast of North America, Central America, and South America almost all the way across the Pacific in a wedge that stretches to the west. The health and productivity of the entire ocean is now at risk. The Union of Forest Research Organizations, with 14 international collaborating partners, have reported that forests may lose their carbon regulating service and that, quote, it could be lost entirely if the Earth heats up 2.5 degrees centigrade. Throughout the American West, tree deaths are now at record levels, with the records being broken year after year. That's the reason why Canada's vast forest has now become a net contributor of CO2 to the atmosphere rather than absorbing it. The Amazon, The forests of Central Africa, Siberia, and Indonesia are all now at risk. This year, a number of groups ranging from the National Audubon Society to the Department of Interior released the U.S. State of the Birds report, showing that nearly a third of the nation's 800 bird species are now endangered, threatened, or in significant decline due to habitat loss, invasive species, and other threats, including climate change. The major shift attributed to the climate crisis related to the migratory patterns and a large, consistent shift northward among a vast range of bird species in the United States. Some of the most intriguing new research is in the area of extreme weather events and rainfall. A recent study by German scientists in the publication Climate Change projects that extreme precipitation will increase significantly in regions that are already experiencing extreme rainfall. Man-made global warming has already increased the moisture content of the air throughout the world, causing bigger downpours. Each additional degree of temperature causes another 7% increase in the moisture content of the world's air and leads to even larger downpours when storm conditions trigger heavy rains and snows. To bring an example of this home, 2009 saw the 8th 10-year flood of Fargo, North Dakota since 1989. Last year in Iowa, Cedar Rapids was hit by a flood that significantly exceeded the 500-year floodplain. All-time flood records are being broken in regions throughout the world. Conversely, those regions that are presently dry are projected to become much drier because higher average temperatures also evaporate the soil moisture. The American West and the Southeast have been experiencing prolonged severe drought and historic water shortages. In a study published in January 2008 in Science, scientists from the Scripps Institute estimated that 60% of the changes in the water cycle in the American West are due to increased atmospheric man-made greenhouse gases. It predicts that although western states are already struggling to supply water for farms and cities, more severe climatic changes will strain the system even more. Agriculture in our largest farm state, California, is at high risk. Australia has been experiencing what many there call a 1,000-year drought, along with record high temperatures. Some cities had 110 degrees for four straight days 2 months ago. And then, of course, they had the mega fires that caused so much death and destruction. Federal officials from our own National Interagency Fire Center report that we have seen twice as many wildfires during the first 3 months of this year compared to the same period last year. Due to the worsening drought, the outlook for more record fires, especially in Texas, Florida, and California, is not good. A number of new studies continue to show that climate change is increasing the intensity of hurricanes. Although we cannot attribute any particular storm to global warming, we can certainly look at the trend. Dr. Greg Holland from the National Center for Atmospheric Research says that we have already experienced a 300 to 400% increase in Category 5 storms in the past 10 years in the United States. Last August, hundreds of thousands of people had to evacuate as Hurricane Gustav hit the Gulf Coast. And then, of course, there's the destruction of Galveston and areas of New Orleans where the residents are still recovering. The same is happening in the rest of the world. Last year, Cyclone Nargis killed 20,000 people in Myanmar and caused the suffering of tens of thousands more. For these and many, many other reasons, now is the time to act. And luckily, positive change is on the way. In February, when the Congress voted to pass the stimulus bill, it laid the groundwork for critical investments in energy efficiency, renewables, a unified national smart grid, and an historic transition to clean cars. This was a crucial down payment that will create millions of new jobs, hasten our economic recovery, strengthen our national security, and begin solving the climate crisis. But now we must take another step together and pass the American Clean Energy and Security Act. Chairman Waxman and Chairman Markey have pulled together the best ideas in the Congress to begin solving the climate crisis while increasing our energy independence and stimulating our economic recovery. Let me highlight just a few items in the bill that I believe to be of particular importance. First, it promotes the rapid introduction of the clean and renewable technologies that will create new, good, sustainable jobs and reduce our reliance on carbon-based fuels. It is time to close the carbon loophole and begin the steep reductions that we need to make in the pollution that causes global warming. Second, it helps us use energy more efficiently and transmit it over a secure, modernized, digital smart grid system. Of course, this move to repower America must also include adequate provisions to assist those Americans who would face a hardship. For example, we must recognize and protect those who have toiled in dangerous conditions to bring us our present energy supply. I believe we ought to guarantee good jobs for any coal miner displaced by impacts on the coal industry. And this bill also focuses on intensive R&D to explore carbon capture and sequestration to determine whether and where it can be a key part of the solution. I have always strongly supported intensive R&D on carbon capture and sequestration and demonstration projects, and I'm happy that at long last this committee has found a way to do that. Our country cannot afford more of the status quo, more gasoline price instability, more job losses, more outsourcing of factories, more years of sending $2 billion every 24 hours to foreign countries for oil. And our soldiers and their families cannot take another 10 years of repeated troop deployments to regions that just happen to have large oil supplies. Moreover, the best way to secure a global agreement that guarantees that other nations will also reduce their global warming pollution is for our country to lead the world in meeting this historic challenge. The United States of America is the world's leader. We are the only nation in the world that can lead. Once we find and reestablish the moral courage to take on this issue, the rest of the world will come along. Now is the time to act before the world gathers in Copenhagen this December to solve this crisis. Not next year, this year. I strongly urge bipartisan support of this crucial legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, very much. And now we turn to welcome our other distinguished American, Senator John Warner. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Waxman, Chairman Markey, and our good friend Chairman Dingell, and the distinguished ranking members, Mr. Upton, Mr. Barton. It's really a privilege to come back to the Congress in the retired status. I assure you that I checked the applicable laws and so forth, and I'm delivering a statement this morning consistent with those regulations, which I shall follow carefully. But I want to say a word about the fine gentleman on my left. We breakfast together this morning just as if we'd still in the Senate together. Talked about the many men and women that mentored us in our legislative careers. And I just want to say to you, my dear friend, you've had an extraordinary public service career, and you're charging ahead as strongly today as you've ever done in the history of that career. And as you said, our parents are rather proud of both of us today. So I thank you, and I thank those in this room that I have served and worked with these years, and for the gracious statements. This is serious business, very, very serious business. Having served 30 years in the other body, I've seen the panorama of legislative challenges in that period, and indeed prior thereto, I served for 5 years in the Pentagon and the Department of Defense and testified for the Congress. But this particular moment in our history is critical. And future generations will look back at this day and tomorrow and in the future and see what we did and maybe what we didn't do. So I thank you, the leadership both the Democrat and Republican of this committee, for taking the initiative and the members to make it work. I think also the committee should pause to express its appreciation to the extraordinary number of organizations, largely the ones I work with today or the nonprofits, but indeed the corporate and business sectors of our country have come together, and I think there's a good, strong, constructive dialogue going on. Unfortunately, we're greeted, as the Vice President and I were talking this morning, by articles like the one in the New York Times this morning. But let's hope that's behind us, and that as members of Congress and as witnesses, we come here and speak the absolute truth, and if I may underline, speak in such a way that all levels of America can understand what the challenges are before us, the complexity, the long, rough road ahead to reach those goals that hopefully this legislation will establish, and that my beloved Senate will join in a conference and we'll get a law. All too often, I have watched, and each of us have, the advertisements today, and they oversimplify the problem. I mean, you see very attractive actors and actresses get out and say, well, clean coal technology is just around the corner. We know it's not around the corner. They talk about, well, wind power. Wind and solar are vital parts of working our way out of this situation. But each of those requires substantial planning, engineering, tax subsidies, support. Take, for instance, we're talking about the smart grid. It looks to be a quicker approach to begin to correct things with that smart grid. But to do it, we're going to have to work through condemnation laws to get the land over which those grids have got to travel, particularly to convey the energy from the very valuable and abundant source of wind. I saw the other day where in California, the solar panels are using an extraordinary amount of water. So when you go into one situation, you've got to figure out what it affects adversely in the other. So this is a tough road ahead of us, and I'm glad the leadership of this House of Representatives has tackled it and going to move forward. The Vice President very carefully carried a lot of the factual material here this morning, and I won't try and repeat it. I would ask unanimous consent my entire statement go in.
Without objection.
Because I want to move through somewhat swiftly so we can take the questions and actually hear from the membership. Since I've retired or left the Senate, I've continued to work in this area and will continue to do so because I feel very strongly committed. I was privileged for 14 months in the Senate to join with my very good friend, Joseph Lieberman, an extraordinary, courageous legislator, in putting together our bill. And with the support of our chairman, Senator Boxer, and a lean but nevertheless majority of the Senate, I was the only Republican that cast a vote to get that bill out. I don't say that in any derogatory sense towards my colleagues. I respect their views. But I think as we go along, and one of the things that I go back and wish we had done was to give a little territory to get that bill through. And we didn't perhaps give enough territory to begin to get at least a greater deliberation than the few days on the Senate floor to have laid a stronger foundation for this committee and other elements of the Congress to cover this subject. I want to talk about that foundation. In my judgment, this subject of climate change, the future of energy, and our national security are all interwoven very closely. And I hope that the Congress recognizes that they've got to build their legislation on a foundation with 3 legs on it: the energy leg, the global climate change leg, and the national security leg. And it's that national security that I want to dwell on here for a few minutes, because I think that's the most significant contribution I can make. I want to credit many national security experts who have expressed their concerns, most of which I share. Many senior retired officers, and I say with a sense of humility, I've had an opportunity, many years in the Pentagon, many years in the Congress on the Armed Services Committee, to work with these same officers today who are retired. They don't have a political bone in their system. They're only speaking out in terms of their projection of the responsibilities for the armed forces of the United States as this global situation appears to worsen. And I'll address the specifics on that. But I don't often like to take quotes, but this one I think is worthy of your attention. One extraordinary soldier, one I worked with, and you did too, Mr. Vice President, the former Chief of Staff of the United States Army, General Gordon Sullivan, who chaired the Military Advisory Board on the Center for Naval Analysis. That center has done a lot of valuable work in this area. Succinctly framed the situation as follows. The Cold War, and he's referencing, of course, the former Soviet Union. The Cold War was a specter, but climate change is inevitable. If we keep on with business as usual, we will reach a point where some of the worst effects are inevitable. Back then, the challenge was to stop a particular action. Now the challenge is to inspire a particular action. We have to act if we are to avoid the worst of the effects. If I may, I was hoping that Chairman Dingell would be here today. I want to go back and just a brief personal recollection. I grew up during the Great Depression and then the years of World War II. I was privileged to, in the last year of the war, wear the uniform of a young sailor when my distinguished colleague, Chairman Dingell, was really in the thick of the fighting. Well, you are now. But our generation was referred to as the greatest generation. But the thing about it is, and I don't want to be too prosaic, but I think back of the inspiration that it took to get through those periods in American history. Went back and read that wonderful speech given by Franklin D. Roosevelt in his first inaugural. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. There's a very substantial element of fear attached to this subject. Now, we are, as a nation, together with other nations in the world, facing one of the most unprecedented and difficult economic situations ever in history. We also have our brave men and women of the armed forces fighting 2 wars. And the question is raised, is this the time to challenge an issue of this magnitude, which has ramifications of cost to everyone here in this country, and is going to require sacrifices? And I say to you, as my distinguished colleague said, yes, it is the time. I witnessed personally the nation survive those trials of the Depression and the war, and then emerge and redevelop itself and become a stronger nation, stronger than any of us ever imagined we could achieve in the late 40s and 50s. We can do that again, but it's going to take your leadership. We will do it again. We have to, because every day that goes by increases the cost, as I understand it, involved in this situation. Let me say that one thing that we've got going for us as legislators is that there is a desire among a broad cross-section of the American people to do something. They want it done. They don't understand all the complexity and all the technical things, but instinctively they're saying, we're with you. But the duty we have is to be honest with them, tell them it's going to be a burden, and tell them it's going to take time. I mean, clean coal technologies, which is so important to my state, Virginia. And I've looked into this question of capture and sequestration and transfer and sequestration. That's going to take big bucks and a lot of time to perfect it. So I say to you most respectfully, as I look back at the legislation that we put forward in the Senate, we had in there provisions, and I used to characterize it that the President of the United States as the engineer driving this big train. He had the throttle to push. He had the brake to slow down. In order to allow our power sector, our engineering sector, transportation sector, manufacturing sector, to do the job that I think in their heart, instinctively, they want to do, we've got to give them the assurance that the timetables we establish have got to be such that they can keep pace with their responsibility to meet the needs of the citizens today, and at the same time engage in the research and development of the solutions that we have, but to do it in a timely fashion. The most challenging thing for this committee and this legislation is to devise that language, to give the President, and the President has stepped forward and shown a measure of strong leadership on this subject and a willingness to work with the Congress. But we've got to devise that language that enables the President, and indeed the people in this country, to do the work that's got to be done in such a way that we don't put on the burden that they have to bear before the technology has been done and the infrastructure installed for them to continue. I mean, in the coal industry, if we move too swiftly, coal is likely to switch to natural gas. Now, natural gas, people think it's, you listen to some of them, it's pure, but it has 50% of the greenhouse carbon and so forth. Am I not correct? As does coal. And we don't have identified yet the sources of gas to meet that demand if the power industry suddenly were forced, as a matter of necessity, so as not to violate the law, to shift to gas. So give to the President the language. I wrote it in the previous bill, and I hope that you can even do a better job to give the President the authority to correct certain situations if this country cannot meet its obligations under the law. So if I were in the Senate today, I would be doing one other thing, and that is I would be working to try and incorporate language, I hope in both bodies, that would recognize the enormous benefit of bringing to the table. You had commerce, you had energy, you had transportation at this table, but bring to the table the defense sector, the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, and certain elements of the infrastructure in the private sector that support our defense, and let them express their views. Let them be charged by the Congress in this legislation for the accountability to do their share to reach these goals. Because, as the Vice President recited, the effects of climate change, and I'm not here to argue the science, but certainly the reality. He spoke about the Arctic, the Antarctic, and the North Pole, and so forth. We were talking about those submarines, how they had to do the scientific work to determine the thickness of the ice, and how that database, which was begun in 1958, now shows you how much that has shrunk over a period of time. But it's the members of the military that will be called upon to help those nations who, as a consequence of the erratic nature of climate change, could be losing their sovereignty, suffering mass migrations, political instability, creating a vacuum. So many of these nations are now on the verge of political collapse, and this push from a climactic condition could shove them over where they lose their sovereignty. Somalia is an example of that, with the droughts on that littoral of Africa. We've got to be sure that we're doing everything to alleviate these situations, because we're the only country that has the military capability, particularly the lift capability, the transportation capability, to get there in a timely way and do what we can in a humanitarian way to alleviate the suffering that is occasioned by these situations. Stability in the world is absolutely critical. And we're called upon, as you said, Mr. Vice President, we are the leader. We are the one that has the strongest of the militaries. And we will be called upon. To the extent that our military has to perform missions occasioned by climatic conditions or others, is the extent to which they have less ability to do missions elsewhere. So there's a direct cause and effect between what our military are called upon to do our normal role of protecting freedom in the world and to meet these situations. Whether it's crop failures or famine, disease, mass migration of people across borders, destruction of the vital infrastructure, all of these things can lead to failed nations and instability. So I just want to conclude by saying we're the best equipped, we're prepared. The United States has always been of a soft heart to help those less fortunate than ourselves. And this poses a real problem. I go back to one other admiral. I served with him when he was NATO commander, NATO South. And he said, as part of the military advisory board, national security and the threat of climate change. He said, this is Admiral Joseph Lopez. I think Joe has only voted. I don't know if he's ever done anything in the political world. I've known him that well. And he said, you have a very real change in natural systems that are most likely to happen in regions of the world that are already fertile ground for extremism. That sums it up. And delaying action on this just raises costs, leaves us less prepared to try to alleviate the stress that will be put on our military. So I strongly urge that you look at the possibility of injecting in this record somewhere the views of our departments and hopefully language which will hold them accountable and make them as much a partner as the other departments and agencies of our government. And I'm sure my good friend, Congressman Ike Skelton, can work with you to see that happens. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator, very much.